All right, thanking God again for another day, but not only another day, the chance to finish yet another book of the Bible as we have come to the last chapter of Mark 16, a chapter that I would like to call the messenger, understanding that this chapter is going to describe the way in which the fundamental messenger of God, the Christ, is going to be resurrected from the crucifixion that we saw in chapter 15, where the first three verses or so are going to describe the way that, as we mentioned at the end of chapter 15, two women, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, it's going to say there, but it's going to be, if it's the same Mary, Mary, the mother of James and Salome, as they observed where he was laid, they were going to bring spices, which they do at the beginning of chapter 16, to try to give him a proper burial. However, they have a problem. By verse 3, we see that they wondered who would roll away the stone. Verse clear, making it 4, that they were worried about nothing because the stone had already been rolled away, at which point in verse 5, going from verses 5 through 8, it's going to show that they saw a young man who told them not to worry or wonder where the Christ was, because as he had promised, he wasn't going to stay in the grave. However, they should go and meet or tell his disciples to expect to see him as he promised in Galilee, with the oldest manuscripts, as I have the ESV saying that they end the book of Mark there. However, other manuscripts include something that we would possibly call Mark's version of the Great Commission, something that's a lot more similar to the way in which we saw Matthew end his description of the gospel or the life of Christ, because it is going to go on to say that there are additional manuscripts that include the way in which Mary Magdalene went and eventually told them that, or told others that she had seen the risen Christ. However, verse 11 is going to say they would not believe it. She is not the only one, though, because in verses 12 through 13, there are two others who are going to tell people that they saw the risen Christ in a story that's going to be given a longer description in Luke's description of the life of Christ, or Luke's gospel, as they are likewise going to be in verse 13, rejected. It's going to say, but they likewise would not believe those two either, at which point Jesus himself is going to appear to the 11 remaining apostles, understanding that Judas is no longer with them because he has by this time killed himself as a consequence of what he had done to the Christ. But in verses 14 and forward, moving toward the end of the chapter, he is going to rebuke them for their unbelief and hardness of heart. In verse 15, going on to give what we call the Great Commission, or Mark's version of what we might call a Great Condition, telling them to go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Verse 16 saying, whoever believes and is baptized, they will be saved. But whoever does not believe will be condemned. Going on in verses 17 and 18 to give them the accompanying signs that they can expect to endorse the work that they are about to do in what we now know as the book of Acts. Verses 19 and 20 ending up the chapter, helping us to understand that that's exactly what happened. Verse 19 reading, so then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs. What we'll see more of in, as we mentioned, the book of Acts, as the book of Mark, much like Matthew is the conclusion of the gospel, at least Mark's description of the life of Christ. Now it's time for the apostles to pick up the baton. And unlike a lot of chapters, this chapter has a final verse that probably stood out to me as a good way to summarize what my takeaway is from not only chapter 16, but the entire book of Mark. And for whatever reason, this time it is the thing that seems to distinguish Christianity from other faiths. Understanding this caveat, I have not studied other faiths the way that I have studied Christianity. I want to ask, understand it, we don't get a lot of replies. But to the degree folks see this video and understand other faiths, I want to get additional input so that I'm not stating my takeaway as the authority on the way that Christianity compares with other faiths, but I want to state it candidly so it can open a discussion for those of us who may understand maybe a little bit better balance between Christianity and other beliefs. But the role that God actively plays in the growth of Christianity and before that, the growth of Judaism is unique to those two faiths in a way that I have not seen in my study of any other religion. And the last chapter of the book of Mark reminded me of that when it talks about the way in which the great things that Christ did were evidence that God was the power behind his work. And those things were not going to stop with him because they are going to carry over into the book of Acts. And they are the thing that kept others from believing that once they killed the Christ, the movement was over, because there is no book of Acts if the apostles were not continuing to do the kinds of things that the people had become familiar seeing the Christ do. And so they second guessed their decision to kill the Christ, which is why by the time we get to Acts chapter 2, many of the same people who seems like they might have participated in his crucifixion were now wondering, literally, men and brethren, what shall we do? In response to Peter's charge that you were the ones who actually killed the Christ. And so what happened was Christianity became a movement that was based on the fact that they could not kill the message, even if they could kill the messenger. Bottom line was, to those who believed, they began to realize that they couldn't kill the messenger because they couldn't account for the body. And the thing that they likewise, as we mentioned back in Matthew's gospel, one of the things that they could not control was the message, because they made a concerted effort to say that the body was stolen, because once the authorities who were responsible for killing him could not account for the body, they had to say something. But much like they could not kill the message, they could not control the narrative. And God, through the signs and the continuing miracles that he did through the apostles, was going to continue to prove the point that this was not a movement made of man's manipulation or by force, and it was going to grow far beyond the influence of mere philosophy, understanding that Paul, midway through the Acts, is going to deal with a lot of the competing philosophies of the day in establishing his role as one of the foundational members, an additional apostle, if you will, who would make sure that Christianity would not only outgrow the philosophies of his day, but likewise would outgrow any philosophies that we have surviving even today. Understanding all of that, God was actively demonstrating to people that beyond the competing philosophies that they might have had at the time, he was actively doing things that no man could do or think of. And in comparison to the way in which many faiths or religious movements gained their strongest influence in places where they could exert some form of coercion, whether it was by sword or later on by the gun or by some form of financial manipulation or social coercion, God made Christianity grow in spite of coercion, taking us back to the end of the book of Mark, showing us that Christianity's origin story seems to be unique, distinct from any other in the way that David seemed to recognize in his day, and that is his success would only go so far if it was promoted by his sword, his power, and his military might, realizing that the greatest success came from the endorsement that he got from God. God who subdued nations that were actually stronger than he was at the time he was trying to get established as king of Israel. And so as we see him establishing, meaning God establishing Christ as the final king on the throne of David, we seem to see him doing something similar to the way in which he endorsed David. And that's giving him free publicity that comes from God himself, turning the attempts to crucify the Christ into the kind of publicity that no other faith before or after could produce. And that's the resurrection of its foundational martyr and the survival of the miracles, meaning the works that he did that were clearly The works that persuaded the people that the Christ was from God survived on in the works of the apostles that we will see going forward into the book of Acts. Signs from God so persuasive that much of the first church was composed of those who had actually participated in killing the Christ.